Mid-Atlantic, November 1912, 4 o'clock in the morning. Aboard the RMS Mauretania, 2 days out from Queenstown and 3 from New York, a post office sorting clerk stood at a frame bolted against the ship's roll, in a room with no portholes, sorting a business letter posted in Liverpool 6 days earlier into a sack marked for the General Post Office. New York. He had not been engaged by Cunard, and he did not answer to the ship's captain. He was post office staff, seconded to a vessel that Cunard owned, and that the Admiralty part-financed, and that carried, stenciled into its registration, 3 letters that made it something other than a passenger ship. RMS. Royal Mail Ship. The letter in his hand knew none of that. It knew only that it had been posted for the Saturday sailing, and that a desk in New York was waiting for it on a date fixed months in advance. Because Cunard's contract with the Crown required the Mauretania to dock on schedule whether she carried 40 first-class passengers or 400 in steerage. He could tell, before he even turned an envelope over, whether it had come from a shipping office or a private house, because business correspondence for the Saturday boat arrived at the sorting office in thick, pre-addressed bundles, tied by clerks who had done this every week for years, while a private letter travelled alone. In handwriting, the sorting frame had no folder for. He had done this crossing perhaps 200 times in 9 years, though no record of that number was ever kept for public consumption, because the mailroom staff were not the story the shipping lines wanted told about their liners. The story was the dining saloon, the turbines, the blue riband. The clerk's story was a frame, a lamp, and a sack that had to be right. The clerk sorted the letter, sealed the sack, and moved to the next frame. He did not know what the letter said. He knew, precisely, what date it was contracted to arrive. What was the difference? On the North Atlantic in 1912, between a ship that simply carried the post and a ship that had signed, in effect, a promise to a stranger in Liverpool that her letter would reach New York on a specific tide. The 3 letters were not decoration. From 1840, when the Admiralty signed its first article of agreement with Samuel Cunard's British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, RMS meant a specific, contracted obligation, a ship built or chartered to carry the nation's overseas correspondence on a fixed timetable in exchange for a fixed annual payment from the Crown. Cunard's Britannia carried the designation first, sailing from Liverpool on 4 July 1840 and reaching Halifax on schedule 10 days later. The beginning of the first ever timetabled steamship service across the Atlantic. Within a year, Britannia and her 3 sister ships were running a fortnightly service, reliable enough that a merchant in Liverpool could tell a partner in Boston, in writing, the exact week his reply would arrive. That reliability was the entire point. A sailing ship crossed the Atlantic when the wind allowed it, 2 or 3 times a year if the weather was unkind. A contracted steamship crossed on a published date because the post office had built that date into the price it was paying Cunard to guarantee it. The RMS prefix travelled from Britannia to Titanic, to Lusitania, to Mauretania, to Olympic, and eventually to the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. Each one, beneath the passenger trade, the shipping companies advertised, still working the same contracted job the Britannia had started. Sail on time, carry the mail, prove the date on the envelope was not a guess. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail's history. The ship, the round, the sorting office, and the letter the system carried. Not nostalgia for grand liners. The documented operational reality of a postal contract, and what it meant to a stranger waiting for a specific date. What Cunard's postal clerks carried in a sealed room below the waterline was not cargo. It was a promise, stenciled onto a hull, that a letter would arrive on a specific tide. And if you remember writing to relatives who crossed the Atlantic by sea, or waiting for a letter timed to a specific sailing, put it in the comments. What do you remember about waiting for the mailboat? Next on this channel, the night the Mount Pleasant sorting office worked through the Blitz. Back on the round. What the RMS designation gave a shipping company was prestige and a subsidy. What it required of that company was something the ship itself could not do alone, because a timetable is not kept by steel and turbines. It is kept by the people who load, sort, and land the mail fast enough that the schedule survives contact with an actual port. What was that job? And who did it? The job was sorting, and sorting at sea was not the same skill as sorting on land. A post office clerk working the frames at a provincial sorting office could step outside for air, hand a jammed sack to a colleague, wait for a delayed train. A clerk in an RMS mailroom had none of that. The room moved. The frame was bolted down because the ship was not. Days out from Queenstown, working under a swinging deck lamp, the mailroom staff sorted the outward post in transit, days ahead of arrival, so that by the time the ship reached New York or Boston, sacks were already tallied, tied, and ready to be swung by crane straight onto the waiting mail wagons on the pier, without a single letter needing to be resorted on dry land. That single fact is what made the RMS contract possible at all. Not that the ship was fast, though it was, but that the sorting had already happened before the gangway went down. A liner that simply carried mail as cargo would have landed it exactly as disorganized as it had been loaded. An RMS liner landed it finished. Because for 4 or 5 days, in a windowless room below the waterline, a small crew of post office staff, hired independently of the ship's crew, had been doing at sea the same disciplined work their colleagues did on land at Mount Pleasant or at Liverpool's own sorting office, except with the added difficulty of a floor that would not stay still. A sorter who had done the crossing for years could tell, from the weight and the knot of a sack alone, roughly which office it had been built at, because each office had its own habits of tying and its own order of stacking. A piece of institutional knowledge that existed nowhere in writing, only in the hands of the people who did the job. They knew, from doing this crossing dozens of times, exactly how a sack built for Boston differed from one built for New York before either was opened. What did 4 days of sorting at sea, done properly, save on the other end of the ocean? And what happened to a mail contract's whole promise if that work was skipped? The letter's meaning came from the schedule, not from the ocean. A businessman in Liverpool who sealed a letter on a Tuesday knew, because Cunard's sailing bills were printed and posted at the post office counter, exactly which ship would carry it, exactly when she left. And, because the contract fixed her speed and her admiralty guaranteed reliability, roughly when she would dock. That is what made a letter posted, for the Saturday boat different from any letter posted before the age of the contracted steamship. It had a known, dateable arrival window on the other side of an ocean, months before the ship that would carry it had even finished loading. For the emigrant family in Liverpool with a son farming in Manitoba, or the colonial administrator in London with a brother posted to Halifax, the RMS sailing list was not shipping trivia. It was the only calendar that mattered. Letters were timed to catch a specific sailing the way a modern deadline is timed to a specific date, because missing the Saturday boat meant a fortnight's wait for the next one, not a delay of hours. Post office clerks sorting the outward mail in Liverpool knew this too. A letter addressed per RMS Mauretania was not a courtesy note to the sorting staff. It was an instruction, and getting it into the wrong sack meant a family in Manitoba going a full sailing cycle without word. It worked the other way too. A post office sorting clerk in Liverpool who saw the words per RMS Mauretania on an envelope did not need to ask which sailing it belonged to, because the shipping companies printed their sailing bills weeks in advance and pinned them at every post office counter along the route. The same public information the family checked before they wrote the letter, and the same information the sorting frame staff checked before they built the sack. The instruction on the envelope and the schedule on the wall were, in effect, the same document, read by 2 different people for 2 different reasons. What did it do to a family's sense of time to organize months of waiting around a boat that left every Saturday rather than around any particular letter. Before you can understand what an Admiralty mail subsidy actually bought, you need to understand what it cost a shipping company to promise a fixed date at all. A businessman's letter, sealed in Liverpool, travelled by rail to the Cunard dock, was boarded with the sacks assigned to that specific sailing, and, for a port too shallow for the liner itself, such as Queenstown, was ferried out by a dedicated tender before the liner had even finished loading passengers. Cunard, and later White Star, kept dedicated fleets of tenders and lighters at exactly this kind of port for exactly this purpose. Vessels that existed for no reason except to keep the mail contract's fixed timetable intact at the one place the liner herself could not physically reach the shore. None of that infrastructure was free, and none of it was optional under the contract. When Cunard built the Lusitania and the Mauretania in 1907 to win back the speed record from German rivals, the Admiralty's backing came with conditions stenciled as firmly as the RMS prefix itself. A low-interest government loan of £2, £6 million toward construction, an annual operating subsidy, and a mail contract worth roughly £68,000 a year, in exchange for a guaranteed service speed of no less than 24 knots and a standing obligation to convert both ships to auxiliary naval cruisers if war required it. The mail contract was never really about the letters alone. It was the mechanism by which the state kept a fast, modern, wartime convertible merchant fleet in permanent commercial service, paid for in large part by ordinary correspondence. The businessman's letter travelling to New York and the Admiralty's naval reserve requirement were sorted, quite literally, into the same hull. What happened when the promise the post office had made to a stranger in Liverpool depended on a ship the Navy had also quietly reserved the right to take away? The people who made the schedule real were a small, specialist crew, seconded to the ship rather than employed by it, and because the shipping company's own publicity was built around dining saloons and turbine records, barely mentioned in the popular history of the ships they sailed on. On the Irish Sea Packet route between Kingstown and Holyhead, that crew numbered 22. Postal sorters drawn from the Dublin postal establishment, working the same disciplined frame and sack system used on the transatlantic run, on a much shorter, much more frequent crossing. On the morning of 10 October 1918, those 22 men boarded the RMS Leinster at Kingstown with, by later account, over 250 sacks of mail to sort on the 70-mile run to Holyhead. Ordinary work, done the way it had been done for years, by men who, by most accounts, knew each other well enough to have gone on strike together 6 months earlier over the threat of conscription in Ireland. Their sorting room sat in the ship's hold, on the port side, in the same position on every crossing, because the frames were bolted in and moving them was not something anyone did between sailings. The Dublin sorters and their transatlantic counterparts on the Cunard and White Star run answered to the same institution and worked to the same discipline, even though the Irish Sea crossing took a single morning and the Atlantic crossing took most of a week. What made both jobs the same job was not the distance. It was the frame, bolted in place, worked at speed, sorted before the gangway went down, whether the sea outside the hull was the Mersey approaches or the open ocean. They were not decorated for this work. They were not, in any photograph the shipping company ever released, the story of the RMS Leinster. What was in that mail room on an ordinary Thursday morning in October 1918, and what happened to the position it occupied in the ship's hull less than an hour after she left port? Shortly before 10 that morning, a German torpedo from UB 123 passed across the Leinster's bow and missed. A second struck the port side, precisely where the postal sorting room stood. The blast tore through both sides of the hull. Of the 22 sorters working the frames, 21 drowned or were killed outright. The only survivor, John Higgins, had been working in the registered letter enclosure with 2 colleagues, Murphy and Atwell, when the ship was hit. A third torpedo finished what the second had started. RMS Leinster sank in roughly 12 minutes, taking with her the greatest single loss of postal staff in the history of the Irish Sea crossing, 1 month before the armistice that would end the war. those sailors and soldiers aboard her, mostly returning from or going on leave, had been fighting. There is a particular cruelty in a mailroom's geography. The sorting room sat low and to one side because that was where the frames had always been bolted, not because anyone had calculated where a torpedo was most likely to strike. And on both ships in this story, the torpedo found exactly that spot regardless. Within days, post office staff on shore had recovered 24 letter bags and 2 parcel bags, sodden, some in fragments, dried them where they could, and forwarded what survived to its addresses. The contract's promise that a letter would arrive on a specific tide had just been proven capable of failing in the most absolute way a promise can fail. It happened again in February 1941. SS Gersopper, a merchant steamer requisitioned by the Ministry of War Transport and carrying mail bags alongside a cargo of Indian silver, was torpedoed roughly 300 miles off the Irish coast. She sank in about 20 minutes, and 84 of her 85 crew were lost. Among the cargo recovered from her wreck, nearly 4.5 kilometers down, 70 years later, were more than 700 letters that had never reached the people they were addressed to. Soldiers writing home, and families writing to soldiers, sealed in a hold the ocean had kept for 7 decades. It is worth naming plainly that the loss on the Leinster and the 7 decades those Gersopper letters spent undelivered were not accidents of a mail system doing something reckless. They were the ordinary risk of a job that happened, for entirely practical reasons, to be done in the most vulnerable part of the ship. What does it mean that the only reason those specific letters were ever read at all was a private salvage company's commercial interest in the silver they had been packed beside? For every letter lost, thousands more arrived exactly as contracted, and the sheer ordinariness of that success is part of why the mailroom disappeared from how these ships were remembered. The RMS prefix gave a shipping company crown prestige and a government subsidy. It gave the post office a fast, reliable, and, everyone assumed, protected channel for the nation's overseas correspondence. What it never gave anyone was a guarantee against war, weather, or mechanical failure. Leinster in 1918 and Gersopper in 1941 were proof that a mail contract offered no protection from a torpedo, only a legal obligation to try. And the prestige of the 3 letters painted on a hull has, over the century since Britannia's first crossing, quietly buried the ordinary labour that justified them in the first place. Most popular retellings of Titanic or Lusitania mention their status as Royal Mail ships only in passing, if they mention it at all. The dining saloons, the turbines, and the disasters themselves crowd out the fact that a sealed room below deck, staffed by people whose names rarely appear on the ship's passenger manifest, was the actual reason the vessel carried 3 letters instead of 2. The post office kept its own internal record of these losses, with far more care than the shipping companies ever gave them in their advertising, because for the post office, the sorting room was not a footnote to the ship. It was the reason the ship existed under contract at all. None of this is offered to diminish the ships themselves, or the genuine engineering achievement the RMS liners represented. It is offered because a fair account of what these vessels were requires the mailroom as much as it requires the turbine room. And for over a century, documentaries and popular histories have found it far easier to film the latter. For the ordinary household, with a son in Manitoba or a brother in the colonial service, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the boat left on Saturday, and the letter, contracted or not, was worth waiting for at the window. What was lost? In a century of remembering these ships, mainly for their tragedies and their luxury, when the mailroom simply stopped being part of the story, the RMS story did not end with a dramatic change in policy. It ended the way most contracts end, quietly. Once a faster alternative existed to fulfill the same promise. Commercial transatlantic aviation, developing through the late 1930s and accelerated by wartime airmail networks, offered something no ocean liner ever could: a crossing measured in hours rather than days. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, priority overseas correspondence increasingly went by air, and the ships that had carried it since 1840 became, for the mail, a slower and steadily less necessary option. The Queen Elizabeth, in service from 1938 to 1968, is generally recognized as the last Royal Mail ship in the traditional sense, the final vessel for which RMS meant what it had meant since Britannia's maiden voyage. A fixed contract, a guaranteed schedule, a sealed room doing disciplined work below the waterline. Her successor, the QE2, entered service in the late 1960s without the prefix at all. Not RMS, not even SS, but MV, motor vessel, because a cruise ship built for a market the airliner had already reshaped did not carry the nation's mail and had no cause to claim the title. The three letters that had opened every crossing since 1840 simply stopped being painted on. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There is more of this history. More sorting offices, more sealed rooms, more letters that only reach the people waiting for them because a contract, a clerk, and a schedule all held. What Cunard's postal clerks carried in a sealed room below the waterline was never cargo. It was a promise stenciled onto a hull. And if you have a letter that crossed an ocean to reach your family, kept in a drawer, a shoebox, a family archive, put it in the comments. What do you know about the ship or the sailing that carried it? Next on this channel, the night the Mount Pleasant sorting office worked through the Blitz. The RMS prefix was not quite finished in the end. In 2004, when Cunard's new Queen Mary II entered service on the Southampton, New York run, Royal Mail granted her the designation as a gesture to 164 years of history. The only ocean liner built in this century to carry it. Two smaller vessels, a Muskoka Lakes steamer and a ferry to the Isles of Scilly, still carry a version of the same three letters today, on routes no transatlantic liner has run in decades. Samuel Cunard's Britannia carried the promise first. In July 1840, the post office clerk sorting mail in the Mauretania's windowless room in 1912 never knew her name. He knew only the date a sack was due and made sure it was ready. The sea did not always keep that promise, but for 120 years, more often than not, it did, and the letter never had to know how.